Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beitel. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. We're in a short summer season of episodes with women authors, which is a very broad category that allows us to talk to the many wonderful women who write books as part of their great life and career journeys. And there's no one who answers that description better than Mary Beard, Professor Emerita at Cambridge University, and probably one of the most renowned classicists of our times, as well as being a TV presenter, commentator, the chairperson of the Booker Prize Committee this year, 2026, and a fellow podcaster with Charlotte Higgins. Their podcast is Instant Classics. She's written some 24 books, including Women in Power, a Manifesto, and the renowned bestseller SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome. Her latest book is Talking Classics, The Shock of the Old, and she's with us today. Hi, Mary. It's lovely to see you.
Hi, Ilana. It's great to be here.
That's very, very good. As ever, Mary, could we start out by you telling us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, let's start from now. I'm 71 and I have retired. I spent my whole career, though it was more varied than this might seem, teaching classics at university. I started when I was 24 and I went on till I was 67. Now, I think what's interesting from a kind of women's point of view is really two things. One, I saw over that period a most extraordinary change in the position of women in the academy. Not I think, a big enough change, but an extraordinary one. When I started my teaching job at Cambridge, which was in 1984, I was very soon the only woman lecturer in that department. There was kind of 26 guys and there was me. And when I was an undergraduate, about 10% of my cohort among students were female. It's now more like 50% and there's 8 or 9 women lecturers. There's a slow change, but there's been a change. I think there's been a personal change for me too during that period. In that I suppose I remember very vividly when I started out in the business, being an academic, wanting to speak, wanting to contribute to a field, I was very uncertain how to do it. I was very uncertain what my voice sounded like. I was very uncertain about how to be a classicist, particularly how to be a female classicist, without just pretending to be a bloke, really pretending to be a man, right? And I spent, I suppose, 10, 20 years, obviously in some ways enjoying my job, but feeling that I was always being an actor. I wasn't being me. I was wanting to find a way of speaking that wasn't just pretending to be male. Eventually, I'm not quite sure how exactly. Eventually I did find a way, but I spent years of my early career going to seminars and never opening my mouth. And I never opened my mouth because when I did it, I didn't hear myself.
Yes.
So there've been two big changes. A change in the academy in terms of gender balance and the rest, but also there's been a change in me.
I think that's really, really great to hear. I think a lot of people are going to ask now something that puzzles them. So what is a classicist, and is a classicist an historian?
Classicist is, of course, a kind of obscure term of art, which is meant to be very vague. Classicist, you might say, is anybody who studies what we might call the ancient classical world. Now, ancient Greece and Rome are obviously part of that, but they're not all. It goes to the boundaries of the Mediterranean, into what we might call the Near and Middle East, and it involves all aspects of that ancient culture. It involves philosophy, history, language and literature. We read the Odyssey and the Iliad, and people specialize in different aspects of it, really. And I think that's why it's always been for me a great subject, because I've been largely an historian But because I was working within something called classics, it meant that I could do some archaeology, I could do literature. And so it's a very fluid subject, which includes, right up to the minute, how people today use the ancient world. So there are plenty of classicists, so-called classicists out there who are busy studying Nolan's Odyssey, because classics kind of includes not just deep antiquity, but the way that deep antiquity has been reprocessed and represented right up to
And
now.
to do the Odyssey right at the beginning, or should we leave that till later on?
It's up to you, Ilona. I think perhaps we ought to. We might never get out of the Odyssey if we start at the beginning.
Yeah.
Let's hang on to the Odyssey for a bit. But
Yes, exactly.
so it's a subject of wonderful broadness, right? And what's interesting actually is it probably doesn't mean anything very much outside the UK. Slightly, it's been taken over in a way in the United States, where there's departments of classics. So they often now rename themselves departments of ancient Mediterranean culture because they think classic sounds a bit kind of old-fashioned. But it's a very distinctive UK combination of everything that you might put together that is something to do with antiquity.
Now, I'm going to be a bit provocative on that one. Isn't that a lot to do with the fact that history in the UK for a long time was narrative history? And therefore, it was quite, I'm saying this as an historian of more modern time, who attempted to also bring sociology and psychology into her PhD and was successful. But this is probably we're talking about the same period. This is the 80s when, history of everyday life was coming in and history of a variety of other things was also. Up until then, history was pretty much, politics, sort of.
I think you're right up to a point there. But I think, I don't mean to bang the drum for my little bit of the ancient world. But I think that one of the advantages of that very wide interdisciplinary subject that is classics has been, is that while narrative history, has been a thread running through it, that's for sure, the combination of all these different aspects has meant that daily life, literary history, history from below, the history of ideas, has always been much easier to incorporate into a classical syllabus than perhaps it would be to incorporate it into, early modern British history.
Yes.
I think that, the kind of different building blocks that made up and have always made up something called classics has enabled it for centuries, actually, to escape from simply being narrative history. If you go back, as I did once, and I looked at the exam papers that were being sat by undergraduate students in Cambridge in the late 19th century, there were questions in parts of the exam on everyday life. It now seems incredibly radical that there should be they were blokes, basically, almost all men. But they were sitting down and writing answers to questions about the rules of Roman marriage. And that was something that was actually, within a rather apparently conservative subject, that was actually opened up for them through the whole culture aspect that classics kind of sold itself as.
Which is the wonderful thing about it and probably why it attracted so many people. I do remember my late wonderful mother, who was brought up in Manchester, and she recalled that her A-level Latin exam was on a text about growing vines in southern France.
That's right.
And in Manchester, in post-war Manchester, that was about as obscure as you could.
Yeah, and, although we have a rather kind of authoritarian view sometimes of classic, state epics and things like that, part of the fun of it is that you're reading, you can read treatises on aqueducts, you can read comedies, you can read satires and squibs, you can read, kind of soft porn. There is a huge range of stuff, which I think, has always, despite their fusty image, and I'm not going to deny they have a fusty image, and sometimes a rather kind of right-wing image. Despite that image, it's always prompted people studying the classical world, however you define the boundaries of the classical world. It's prompted them to look outside standard narratives.
Yeah, and I think that is the wonderful thing about it. And in many ways is the subject of all your books, but of course of your latest book.
Yeah.
And which is based on a series of lectures, I understand. What I have to ask you to repeat the story about what fascinated you. What
okay,
great story.
Yeah, I mean, I did this series of lectures at the University of Chicago, and I wanted, look, when you get to be my age, if you don't actually now say, look, this is why I think this subject is worth doing, I mean, you might not get a chance. I mean, I think that you have to remember that, it's old people are the people in a hurry in this world, not young people. Young people have got a lot of time to do things. Old people have got to do it quick. So I gave this series of lectures in Chicago about, what I think I've got out of it and what I think its justification is. And I wanted to start with the very first moment that I recall being interested, sparked by the ancient world. In this case, it wasn't the classical world. It wasn't Greece and Rome. It was Egypt. And I was 5, and I still remember this vividly. We lived in a small village on the borders of Wales. And my mum, who was the village school teacher, thought it was about time that I saw the capital city, that I went to London, because I'd never seen any town bigger than Shrewsbury to this point, which is, I can tell you, a small town. So we went to London for a long weekend, and one of the places we were going to go was the British Museum. I'm going to do some frivolous things too, but the British Museum was on the agenda. And, it's very big. My mum said, what are we going to see there? And of course, like every kind of slightly ghoulish 5-year-old, I thought, the Egyptian mummies, please, right? That's what every 5-year-old wants to see. So she said, fine. But, I said she was the village school teacher. And of course, her school teacherly aspect came out, because she said, well, that was all right. But if we were going to see how the ancient Egyptians died, we had to see how they lived as well. So we went to a room devoted, after the mummies, to the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. When we went in, my mum almost instantly said, oh my goodness me, look at the back of that case. There's a piece of ancient Egyptian bread, 4,000 years old. Now, at this point, you could forget the mummies as far as I was concerned. What I wanted to see then was this piece of bread, right? 4,000-year-old bread. But museums back then weren't very child-friendly. This was at the back of the case. The case was terribly high. She tried to lift me up, but it was all it's very awkward. That moment, a guy walks past who says, was I trying to look at anything in particular? And I said, yes, that piece of bread, the back of the case. And he must have been a curator, because he put his hand in his pocket, he got some keys out, he opened the case, and wonder upon wonder, he got the piece of bread out of the case and held it right in front of me. Now, that was a mind-changing experience. So the idea that, first of all, that I could be so close, eyeball to eyeball, with this ancient Egyptian 4,000-year-old piece of bread. But also, as I came later to see in particular, the idea that this guy would do that for me, that this guy would, museum cases were things that opened, and things came out of them. They didn't just stay locked inside. And I think it was the first thing that made me just amazed by the excitement of the very distant past. Now, the end of this story ought to be I became an Egyptologist. But, I didn't. They didn't teach hieroglyphs. You couldn't do it at school. But I did the next best thing, which was Latin and Greek. But that moment always stuck with me. That moment when you're so close, but of course in other ways so far from these things that still remain around us from the ancient
There was
world.
a reality to the past somehow.
Yeah, that's right.
Material reality as well as a conceptual reality.
Yes. A puzzling one, a very puzzling one.
And what has puzzled you throughout the years, do you think?
This is going to sound a bit academic, but I think it is the intellectual puzzle of, well, to put it very quickly, what the past is, really. I mean, there I was in the gallery, and I was as close as anybody could possibly be to this real stuff, this everyday domestic stuff. Not the gold and the mummies or whatever. This is bread, an ordinary piece of bread. I was as close as it could possibly be. And yet, what was it to kind of make sense of that? What was it? What was it? Was this bread like my bread? How did you bridge the gap between now and that very far away then? And that, I think, is the puzzle that has always niggled at me. Because you do television programs. I've learned a huge amount from doing television. But quite often after you've done one, people will come up to you and say, gosh, that was amazing. Weren't the Romans just like us? And you want to say, well, in some respects, yeah, they were. They were human beings. They slept, they ate, they made love, they went to the lavatory. There are all kinds of things that we share with them. But the intriguing thing about them and what keeps you going is that, of course, in all kinds of ways, they were completely different from us. And that's the puzzle about the past, that ambivalence about it being so weird and so foreign that you could hardly begin to understand it. I mean, the example I often give now is Romans, ordinary Romans, maybe apart from a few rich ones, they wouldn't have known what they looked like. They had no proper mirrors. Here we are on Zoom, and the one kind of face we know better than every other in the 21st century is our own face, because we see it in a laptop screen. What would it be like? Can you ever understand a world in which ordinary people didn't know what they looked like? They couldn't recognize themselves. What would it be like to be you if you didn't know what you looked like?
Fabulous.
And I think those kind of questions, they're very simple questions. They're not technical questions. But for me, they're as intriguing, puzzling, and, in the end, as exciting as, space travel. It was exciting to see the dark side of the moon and Artemis 2 or whatever when a few months ago when the moon voyage happened. And I had a frisson of excitement too. I get even bigger frisson of excitement for wondering what it's like to see the past.
That I can completely appreciate, and you do it wonderfully well as ever. But isn't the past also, and here I would bring, you write rather well. You use the example of Hitler's visit to Rome in 1938 being hosted by Mussolini.
Yeah.
Two guys. But the uses and abuses of the...
Yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways I don't think the past certainly doesn't need to apologize for that, but I think neither do we. I think the past is there for us. We're going to use it. We are going to abuse it. We want to think about it quite a lot, particularly, I think, I'm afraid, if you're a classicist, quite a lot of the uses of that past have been for political causes that we feel, let's say, putting this very euphemistically, uneasy about, right? And that's today. That the far right in the United States, supremacists, tend to use images taken from the classical world as branding slogans for their own white supremacist doctrine. And in the middle of the 20th century, Mussolini in particular was hugely investing in the Roman past of Italy. as a way of branding himself. And the truth is that he did huge amounts of excavation in Rome, and or he didn't do it himself. He sponsored huge amounts of excavation in Rome, occasionally symbolically wielding a pickaxe. But and we are in some ways the inheritors of those. A lot of what we see now in Rome was dug up under fascism. And what I think is first of all quite chilling is the way that was so embedded a part of the fascist regime. And the visit of Hitler that I write about in the book and that you just mentioned was one very big moment of that Mussolini really wanted to show off to Hitler what he had done in recovering the ancient, and particularly the ancient imperial past of Rome. And there are very famous photographs and a few bits of film still of the guided tour that Hitler had, which was designed very much to underline the achievements, the modern, classical, joined achievements of Mussolini. And I think it has prompted many people, totally understandably, to say, look, classics is absolutely embedded. It can't escape the taint, for example, of mid-20th century fascism. To some extent, no, it can't. But I think, and this is what the book tries to do in a way, is to say that's only one side of the story. Because the most famous picture of Hitler and Mussolini shows them together admiring some panels of sculpture that had recently been excavated and were part of the first emperor's Augustus, his altar of peace. It sounds very liberal. Altar of pacification would be a better. One of the greatest, but also slightly unnerving monuments of the first emperor Augustus in the very end of the first century BCE. And there's a very famous photograph of Hitler and Mussolini looking at this. And they're having it explained by a young man who often doesn't get mentioned, a young man in military uniform. And he's clearly pointing out what they should be looking for in this sculpture. And you say, who's that young man? Well, that young man is a guy called Ranuccio Bianchi-Bandinelli. Probably he went on to become probably the most famous classical archaeologist in Italy, probably in Europe in the second half of the 20th century. And he was an avowedly Marxist archaeologist. And there he is, the proto-Marxist, giving Hitler and Mussolini, the far from proto-fascists, a lesson in Roman sculpture. And you see, look, the lesson I take away from that picture is that you can go all sorts of different ways with classical archaeology, or with what is left of the classical world and the classical tradition. Yes, fascists have claimed it for themselves. Bianchi-Bandinelli claimed it for absolutely the other side. And at the same time as that photograph was taken, it was just around the time of the death of one of Mussolini's biggest enemies, the Marxist theorist, Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, who'd been imprisoned for ages by Mussolini. In his letters and papers from prison, I mean, the poor guy is let out of prison only in time to die, really. He advocates the teaching of Latin in Italian schools. You don't have to be a conservative fascist, or a fascist or a conservative, to back the ancient world. There's a whole tradition of radical politics that are also conscripting the ancient world to its cause. And in some ways, that's also what's exciting about antiquity. We make it mean something, and we can make it mean different things. It doesn't come down to us as kind of branded with an authoritarian label.
No, I think that it's really, I mean, all of history in a sense, all evidence is what you make of it. And I always think of Trevor Roper's History and Imagination, that if you don't bring imagination into the historian's work, you just, there's nothing. When people say it's dry facts, I'm always, no.
And also when people, they often complain about me because they say, but that I don't keep my own morality and politics. I don't keep it out of the history. Well, of course I don't. You're a human being.
Yes.
You can't leave your morality at the study door.
No.
The idea of saying it is illegitimate to criticize the mass slaughter that was involved in gladiatorial displays, because what we should be doing is seeing it how the Romans saw it, and without bringing our own views into it. That must be wrong. I think there's a very, very strong point in wondering how the Romans saw it. What's exciting about history is you do both. You think, can I understand how perfectly ordinary Romans could sit there in a Colosseum for a whole day watching people being killed? And I do want to understand how that could be possible. But I do need to say, well, what do I make of that? What do I make of that? History is about what we make it.
I think we're about to get very geekish, so I'm going to end this in a minute. Yes. But no, what I did want to say is that I think that the historians' craft is very misunderstood, because people think it's still stuck in a very strong idea that it's a narrative, you're telling a story,
yes,
whereas in
right.
fact, the historian's craft, and I was very struck by where you were dismissing the title of your PhD. But nonetheless, the historian's craft, the reason that there is a difference between an historian who's had to go through the whole writing a PhD, sitting a viva, doing the whole thing, is because the craft, the way I was taught it, is that you constantly have to first establish what happened, when, and how, and only then ask why, and to do this repeatedly, because we're talking about change over time. I think I've more or less get it to a minute, the whole thing, which accepts the idea of change also.
I think, and this is very obviously the case with the far distant past, because it's a much more pressing question. But the question that for somebody studying ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt or wherever, the deep past, it has to be, how do we know? Who don't we hear from? How do we know? Whose story are we being told? And that makes a difference to what looks like the simpler question of what happened. Because you can't begin to think about what happened until you think, whose account are we relying on? Did it look like that to everybody? What about different perspectives? And I've always found that not frustrating. I found it amazingly challenging. Can you reach the woman's perspective? Can you reach the slave's perspective? Well, actually, the answer is not as well as you can reach the perspective of Julius Caesar, who's written his autobiography detailing his campaigns in Gaul. No, you can't. But if you don't look for them, you don't find them. If you do look for them, you find much more evidence than you ever thought. You can start to see the perspective of people who have always been tended to be written off as marginal in inverted commas.
Yes, well, we are the marginal, and you were telling me just before we started that it's going to be the 10th anniversary of Women in Power, a manifesto. Tell us first what led you to write Women in Power.
Well, I'm afraid it's another question of being made to do some lectures.
Good. I'm in favour.
More precisely, you get asked to do some lectures. In this case, it was for the London Review of Books, and they were a few years apart, actually. They have a winter series, and it's quite prestigious to do it, and I was asked to do it. I thought, oh, yes, London Review of Books lecture, that'd be great. And so you glow to start with a bit of flattery. As the lecture comes up, you think, what on earth am I going to talk about? then editor of the LRB was getting quite anxious that I hadn't given her a title. And so I remember having a discussion on the telephone. And the old-fashioned landline, I can still remember this discussion. I mean, because I had to say, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. And she said, look, shall I tell you what to talk about? And I mean, she was a long-time editor of the London Review of Books. She'd worked also on the Times Literary Supplement. And like good literary editors, she had a very good hunch about what people would be good at writing about, even when they didn't know it themselves. So she said, talk about the voice of women, women's voices in public. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. That's a very interesting idea. And it was enough to break through my uncertainty about what to do. Because it suddenly, very quickly actually came to me, the silencing of women and my own experience of feeling silenced. Nobody now, and they kind of watch, me going on like this, would think that there was ever a moment when I felt I couldn't speak, but there really was. And I saw that it actually, that was not a 20th, 21st century thing. You go back to the ancient world, you go back to Greek and Roman writers, and you are seeing women you're seeing the silencing of women being enacted, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing so many of our cliches being enacted back then. I mean, one of the things that I think any woman recognizes is, the way that women's voices are described by hostile men. They whine and they screech and they're strident, right? Well, you go back to the critique of women's voices in the ancient world and exactly the same images are coming out. You get a woman who, in ancient Rome, who dares to put herself forward and to speak in public. And people say, is that a dog? It's the barking of a dog. They're animals. And you see, right, okay, Western culture, and I think it's not just Western culture, but, I think it's a good idea to talk about what you know about. Western culture hasn't invented that silencing of women. It's inherited it over centuries and centuries of women being told not to speak. And women finding ways to speak then at the margins. I mean, the famous example there is the tragic example of Philomela, who in Greco-Roman mythology is raped by her brother-in-law, who then cuts out her tongue, literally silences her, in order to stop her saying what happened. What does Philomela do? She weaves the story of what happened into her tapestry. She tells the story with her hands at her loom. So there's the history of women's voices has been both silencing, but also the most amazing improvisation.
But you always have to look for them, though.
But you've got to look for them. It's very easy to say, look, we don't hear the women. Yes, we do. Just look someplace else. And one of the things that was most striking to me was, you go back, in this case, to Homer's Odyssey. And right at the very beginning of Western literature, what do you discover? You discover Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, the woman who is waiting at home in Ithaca for her husband to come home from the Trojan War while he's spending several years with a nymph and other things. She is waiting at home with her son, who Odysseus left when he was just a tiny baby. She's waiting for him to grow up. She's with him. And there is, beginning of the Odyssey, we're at the moment when Odysseus is soon going to make it back home. there's Penelope at one point, in the very first book of the poem, comes downstairs from the women's quarters, which were upstairs. She discovers that the bard is singing a rather gloomy song. She's singing about what a terrible time, all the people who, heroes of the Trojan War, they're having a terrible time getting home. They had 10 years at Troy, and it's now been 10 years coming home. It's just awful. And she says, oh, look, please, could you sing something a bit more cheerful? The kind of ancient equivalent of, could you put a better record on, And at that point, her son, Telemachus, the one who's been growing up all the time Odysseus has been away, comes over to her and says, Mother, shut up. Speech is man's business. You go back upstairs. And she does. That idea of speech is man's business. They're right on particularly mythos, it is public speech. Speech in public is man's business. That has defined a lot of Western culture ever since.
I fear not only Western culture, as you suggested a little bit before, but we are not about to speak about that. But first of all, let's point out that we are defying all of this. Here are two women's voices.
No, and it has, I think, and there always have been exceptions. What I think is slightly gloomy is that, and maybe we fall into one of these categories, not both, women somehow have always been given a voice to discuss women's things.
Yes.
Right? They've always been able to discuss, what the woman's point of view, as long as it hasn't interfered with military things, defence, the economy, etc., etc. Been able to do that. Also, in classical antiquity and through, actually, women have been given a voice when they're victimised. Despite the example of Philomela, which I've just given, you find rape victims in the ancient world being allowed to speak about the rape. Now, that's of course why the rapist in the case of Philomela cut out her tongue. He wasn't going to give her even that privilege. And there's a whole series of rather amazing, partly scripted, no doubt, partly invented, but partly real utterances by Christian martyrs, female Christian martyrs, for example, actually being able to speak, but they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Speech is something you get before you die.
Yeah.
Now, that's not what we're doing. We're talking about women's things.
We are talking about women's voices, but I think that the point you make so terribly well, and which is important to emphasize, is that things have improved, but we're still the defiant ones.
Yes.
Sort of, let's always go back to, men are assertive, women are pushy.
That's right. And even a single adjective like ambitious, when used of a man, is a very positive quality. When used of a woman, it is decidedly not a positive quality. She's very ambitious.
Yes, there's always something very, nearly as bad as being an academic.
That's exactly right. And I think that, I said before that I was, for a time, not very long, I was the only woman in a university department, which was otherwise all men. And to some extent, that put iron in my soul. I thought, I am not going to be beaten by this system. There are all kinds of things I didn't get sussed, like how to speak. Right? But I wasn't going to let it eradicate me, actually. And I had a very kind of feisty mother who was also very much of that view. I think, totally understandably, there'd be loads of people who would be in that position and think, why should I bother with, is this for me? Am I just going to be the woman, slightly patronised, always marginal, in a career for the rest of my life? So, it's all very well to say, well, look, it spurred you on. It did spur me on. It really, I am not going to be bullied out of this place. But other people would think, why bother? that wouldn't be a stupid reaction to have.
Well, I think that a lot of people did think that,
Yeah.
sort of. I started my career in the 80s when I did my PhD, and finished in the 90s. But it was still a huge battle.
Yeah.
A huge, huge battle. And you're also very exceptional because you had a family. I mean, I knew a lot of more successful women who were single. Sort of, you chose the career, and that wasn't just in academia, that was also in diplomacy. You had to choose.
Yeah. If you wanted a career, you had to not have children.
Yes.
That was a base. You might have a husband. You might. Yeah. But you certainly didn't have kids. And there was a sense in which that was supposed to show you weren't quite serious about your career.
Mm. Yeah.
I used to think, who made these kids? This wasn't kind of, a man was involved in this process, right? Why are they allowed to impregnate people? Yes. But those that are impregnated are then supposed to give up everything else and look after the kids.
Oh, or as things did get better, if you recall, then, shoulder pads, women joining law firms and all the rest of it. But then when you had a baby, you were meant to stop everything and stay at home with the child, because if not, you're a bad mother.
Yes. Yeah. And, there's patriarchy, the best weapon, the worst, you might say, but the best weapon of patriarchy is always guilt. It makes women feel guilty. They're guilty about the way they dress, the way they're not looking after their kids, whatever. Patriarchy's got guilt down to a fine art. It imposes it on women.
And again, that unfortunately has been brought down, I think, sort of through religion more than anything else, sort of over generations. But we cannot end this fabulous conversation without doing the Odyssey.
Yeah, gosh, it's been the classical moment of 2026, that's for sure. And I really hope, let me look on the positive side. I really hope that people will go to see the film, and if they haven't read the Odyssey, they will find a translation. It doesn't honestly matter much which translation. It's only, as I've said before, the best translation of the Odyssey is the one you've got in your hand, right? And read the Homer's original. And so, in some ways, for a classicist to have a blockbuster movie adapting the Odyssey is hugely, hugely important. And there has been a tendency, I think, for pedants in my profession to look at what Nolan's done and to kind of finger wag. And, I'm going to confess a couple of times I have too. And the point about this is any adaptation of the Odyssey onto film is going to change the Odyssey. Of course it is. You cannot put the Odyssey onto film without changing it. So I think that what I would like to kind of underline, and there's a woman's point that comes out of this, that the question is not whether Nolan has changed things, but whether those changes have been in some ways worthwhile, what the cost of the changes are, what the benefits of the changes are. Now, I think for me, the problem is that the aggregate of the changes have tended to remove some strong female characters. If you go, if you go to the Homer's original, you find that all the stories that he tells, all the stories that people sort of somehow know about the Odyssey, the confrontation with the one-eyed giant, the Cyclops, and so on. All those stories are told on an island where he fetches up at the very end of it, very near to where the very end of his journey is where he's going to soon be back in Ithaca. And they're told to a very strange society, in ancient Greek terms, where there's a very powerful queen and an amazing daughter called Princess Nausicaa. What Nolan has done is cut all that out. He's included the stories, because you can't have an Odyssey without the stories of the Cyclops and Scylla and Charybdis and all the rest. But he makes Odysseus tell those stories to a sexy nymph who's got Odysseus imprisoned. Also drawn from the Odyssey, perfectly right. What it means is that those absolutely amazingly memorable female characters, and particularly this Princess Nausicaa, who kind of is in a sort of ambivalently, are we going to get married relationship with Odysseus. They are just obscure. They're just eradicated. And he hasn't got rid of all the female characters, but he's got rid of those two in particular, and he's changed some of the others. So that it's become a much more masculine Odyssey. And what people had always noticed about the Odyssey from back into, at least the 19th century and before, is that the Odyssey was a very female-gendered epic. And in fact, the British satirist but also classicist Samuel Butler wrote a whole book called The Authoress of the Odyssey, in which he tried to claim, I mean, I'm sure he's wrong, but he had a very good go at claiming that the Odyssey was written by a woman, was composed by a woman, because unlike, say, Homer's other epic, we say Homer, whoever actually composed it.
Yeah, wrote it. Yeah.
But Homer's other epic, the Iliad, you could take the women out of the Iliad and you'd lose a bit, but you wouldn't lose, but it would still work. You can't do that. The women are actually embedded. And sometimes a woman's point of view is embedded in the Odyssey. And I think that Nolan has watered that down, and I feel obviously a bit sad about that. I mean, he's watered down other things. I mean, the Odyssey is full of jokes. Well, there's a debate about whether there's none or one joke in Nolan's version, and it's very sexy, right? There's a bit of, there's a bit of sex, and it's become a very violent film when the Odyssey doesn't have much violence and fighting in it, actually. It's much more quizzical, domestic, etc. So I think, look, I'm delighted, and I'm hoping that
it's a thumbs down or thumbs up or a sort of thumbs sideways.
Thumbs sideways. And look, I'm not going to, I don't want to fall in with those gloomy pedants who say, oh, this isn't Homer. Of course it's not Homer. When Alexander Pope translated Homer, a famous classicist, Richard Bentley, this is what, 18th century, said, very pretty poem, Mr. Pope, but it's not Homer. Well, it never is,
It never is.
It never is.
It never is. But it's always you, Mary Beard, who's given us this most wonderful, wonderful opportunity to find out more about how you think. Thank you so much for coming on board.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you. It's been great fun. Always, it's talking about the Odyssey is always good fun.
Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer, Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.